Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. My grandfather and I were not close. He was a man I knew mostly through birthday cards that arrived a week late, and stories my mother would tell in hushed, sorrowful tones. He was a recluse, a man who had intentionally untethered himself from the world and from his family. So when he passed away, the inheritance he left me was not one of treasured memories or family heirlooms. It was a key. A single, small, brass key attached to a plastic tag that read, Unit 34B. He had left me the contents of a self-storage unit. His entire life, or what was left of it, was packed away in a 10 by 20 foot metal box at a place called Secure Space Storage on the industrial edge of the city. The task of clearing it out fell to me, his only living relative. It felt less like a duty and more like a final posthumous imposition, a chore he had left behind for the granddaughter he barely knew. I resented it, but I knew I had to do it. The storage facility was a vast, impersonal place, a small city of corrugated metal and concrete. The corridors were long, identical, and poorly lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a sickly yellow glow on everything. The air smelled of dust, damp concrete, and the faint chemical scent of mothballs. It was a place where people stored the things they couldn't quite part with, but had no room for in their lives, a purgatory for possessions. My grandfather's entire existence was housed in this sad, sterile library of forgotten things. The manager, a tired-looking woman with a permanent frown, handed me a map and my own gate access code. She explained that the facility was accessible 24 hours a day, a feature meant for convenience, but which now, looking down the long, empty, and silent corridors, seemed vaguely menacing. My grandfather's unit, 34B, was in the oldest section of the complex, a deep and rarely visited corner of the concrete labyrinth. It felt miles away from the bright, busy world outside. Finding the unit was a disorienting journey. Every corridor looked the same, a repeating pattern of identical, roll-up metal doors. The only sounds were the echo of my own footsteps on the concrete floor and the constant low hum of the ventilation system. It was a deeply lonely place, and I felt a pang of sadness for my grandfather, a man whose final years were defined by this anonymous, sterile box. This was his home, his museum, his tomb. I finally found it. Unit 34B. The metal door was cold to the touch, and the old brass key he had left me was stiff in the lock. With a groan of protesting metal, I rolled the door up, revealing the contents of my grandfather's life. It was packed to the ceiling with boxes, old furniture shrouded in white sheets, and the general detritus of a long and solitary existence. The air that rushed out was stale and smelled of old paper and dust. My task was simple: sort through everything, decide what to keep, what to sell, and what to throw away. It was an archaeological dig into a life I knew nothing about. I designated a corner for keep, a corner for toss, and began the slow, tedious process. I worked mostly in the evenings after my job at the local library, when the facility was at its most quiet, its most deserted. The solitude, I thought, would help me focus. The first few visits were uneventful, if melancholy. I found boxes of old books, his collection of jazz records, a set of woodworking tools. I started to piece together a vague image of the man he had been, a man of quiet hobbies and solitary pursuits. There was a sadness to the task. a sense of intrusion, of reading a person's story after they were gone. I felt like I was getting to know him better in death than I ever had in life. The work was slow. I could only manage a few hours at a time, my energy for the task waning quickly in the stuffy, silent air of the unit. I would leave each night feeling a deep sense of exhaustion, my clothes covered in a fine layer of dust, the scent of old paper and memories clinging to me. The long, echoing corridors of the facility always seemed a little darker, a little more menacing on my way out. But the house was my sanctuary. It was a small rental, but it was bright and clean and entirely mine. The quiet of the storage unit was a dead, sterile quiet. The quiet of my own home was a peaceful, living one. I would come home, take a long, hot shower to wash away the dust of my grandfather's life, and try not to think about the sad, lonely task that awaited me the next day. I believed the two worlds were separate. I was wrong. The sheer volume of his life was overwhelming. Box after box was filled with the mundane minutiae of a human existence. Old utility bills, tax records from the 1990s, instruction manuals for appliances that had long since turned to dust. It was a paper trail of a life lived quietly, methodically, and, it seemed, entirely alone. I felt a growing sense of a man who was not just a recluse, but who was actively trying to erase himself from the world, packing his history away into cardboard boxes. Despite the sadness of the task, there was a certain peace to it. The world outside, with its noise and its demands, could not reach me here. In the sterile, silent world of Unit 34B, the only thing that mattered was the box in front of me, the life within it. I would put on headphones, listen to podcasts, and lose myself in the work. It was a mindless, physical task that allowed my own brain to go quiet. The facility's silence was a perfect backdrop for my own thoughts. I learned more about my grandfather from his possessions than I had in 25 years of his actual life. I learned he was a passionate amateur bird watcher from the stacks of field guides and the pair of powerful, old-fashioned binoculars I found. I learned he had served in the army from a carefully folded uniform at the bottom of a cedar chest. These were the details my mother had never shared, the pieces of a puzzle I was only now beginning to assemble. The storage unit was a world unto itself, governed by its own strange physics of time and memory. Each box was a different year, a different chapter. Opening one was like opening a tomb, the scent of the past rushing out to greet me. I was an archaeologist, and my grandfather's life was the ruin I was excavating. I felt a growing sense of connection to him, a posthumous relationship built on the things he had chosen to keep, to store away from the world. I never saw anyone else in my corridor. The other units in the B section seemed to be as dormant and as forgotten as my grandfather's. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of a box on the concrete floor or the rustle of old paper. I felt like the only living person in a city of the dead, the sole visitor to a vast metal mausoleum. The solitude was so complete, it was almost beautiful. My routine became a well-oiled machine. I would arrive around 7 p.m., work for 3 hours, and leave by 10 p.m. I would tackle one section of the unit at a time, creating a small, clear space amidst the chaos of the boxes. I was making progress. I told myself that in a month or two, the unit would be empty, my strange, sad duty would be complete, and my connection to this place, and to my grandfather, would be severed for good. I felt completely safe. The facility was well lit, if a bit eerie, and my new padlock on the door was a solid, heavy piece of steel. It was a place of locks and keys, of concrete and metal. It was a place built on the very concept of security. The only ghosts here were the ones made of dust and memory, and I was not afraid of them. I was the master of this small, 10 by 20-foot kingdom of my grandfather's forgotten life. This feeling of control, of purpose, was a comforting one. I was bringing order to the chaos he had left behind. I was performing a final, necessary act of familial duty. The task, which I had initially resented, had become a strange sort of mission, a way for me to understand the man I had never known. I was a detective, and the clues were all around me, packed away in cardboard and sealed with tape. But I was a naive detective. I was looking at the evidence of the past, trying to solve the mystery of my grandfather's life. I was completely unaware that a new mystery, a present-day horror, was quietly unfolding around me. I believed I was the only person with an interest in the contents of Unit 34B. I thought the only secrets in this place were the ones my grandfather had packed away himself. I had no way of knowing that my inheritance was more than just a collection of old furniture and forgotten books. I had inherited his space, his possessions, and his quiet, solitary routine. And I was about to discover, in the pages of a dusty, forgotten book, that I had inherited something else as well. I had inherited his fear, and I had inherited the man who was causing it. My investigation into my grandfather's life continued with a quiet, methodical pace. I had cleared a significant portion of the unit, creating a small island of order in the sea of cardboard chaos. One evening, I came across a heavy footlocker, the kind used in the military. It was unlocked. Inside, nestled among his old army uniform and a collection of medals, was a small, unassuming cardboard box filled with his personal papers. It felt like I was about to find the heart of the maze. I sat on the cold concrete floor, the single bare bulb of the unit casting a harsh light, and I began to sift through the contents. The box was filled with old letters, photographs, and official documents. But tucked at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a set of 5 small leather-bound books. They were diaries, his diaries, spanning the last 20 years of his life. My breath caught in my throat. This was the ultimate intrusion, the final, most private layer of his existence. For a long moment, I hesitated. This felt different from sorting through his books or his tools. This was his mind, his soul, committed to paper. Did I have the right to read it? But my curiosity, my desperate need to understand the man who had left me this strange inheritance, was too powerful. I convinced myself it was part of the task, a necessary step in understanding his life before I packed it all away for good. I opened the first book. The early volumes were filled with the quiet, mundane observations of a solitary man. He wrote about the weather, about the books he was reading, about the small woodworking projects he was working on. His voice on the page was exactly as I had imagined it. Quiet, intelligent, and deeply lonely. I felt a profound sense of sadness as I read, a grief not for his death, but for his lonely life. I was finally meeting my grandfather, and I was meeting him in the pages of his own solitude. I worked my way through the years, through the quiet, unchanging landscape of his retirement. He wrote about his visits to the storage unit, about organizing his things, about the simple pleasure of having a space that was entirely his own. This unit was not a purgatory for his possessions. It was his office, his workshop, his sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where he seemed to feel a sense of peace and purpose. The thought was unbearably sad. It was in the final volume, the diary from the last year of his life, that the tone began to change. The neat, precise handwriting became slightly more erratic, the entries shorter, more focused. He started mentioning another person. He never gave him a name. He only ever referred to him as the man from 34B, my own unit. The coincidence sent a small, cold shiver down my spine. I had assumed 34B was just a number, but it seemed it was a location that was significant to him. The first few mentions were casual. Saw the man from 34B in the corridor again today. He just watches. A week later. The man was there when I arrived and there when I left. He never seems to have anything to move. The entries were tinged with a mild annoyance, the kind you feel for a nosy neighbor. But as the weeks went on, the annoyance began to curdle into something else, something that sounded a lot like fear. He moves things, one entry read, the handwriting noticeably shaky. I know he does. I had the box of records on the left side. I know I did. When I came back today, it was on the right. He is coming in, here when I am gone. He is touching my things. I felt a pang of pity. This was it. The sad, inevitable slide into the paranoia of old age and isolation. My grandfather, alone in this silent, concrete labyrinth, had invented a phantom to torment himself. The entries grew more and more paranoid. He wrote about feeling watched constantly. He described seeing a tall, thin man in a dark watch cap lurking at the far end of the corridor, just standing, just observing. He wrote about hearing strange noises at night, about the feeling that he was not alone in the facility. It was a classic, heartbreaking portrait of a mind beginning to crumble under the weight of its own loneliness. I closed the final diary, a profound sadness settling over me. I now understood the end of his life. It had not been peaceful. It had been filled with a quiet, desperate terror, a fear of a man who was likely nothing more than a figment of his own troubled imagination. I felt a new sense of purpose in my task. I would clear this unit, this place of his final, sad delusions, and I would let his memory rest in peace. I dismissed his fears as the tragic byproduct of a lonely mind. I placed the diaries carefully back in the cardboard box. They felt dangerous, not because of what they contained, but because of the sadness they radiated. It was the sadness of a mind turning in on itself, creating monsters in the shadows to explain the profound, terrifying silence of its own existence. The man from 34B was not real, but my grandfather's fear of him had been. And that was a tragedy I could feel in my own bones. I continued my work for another hour, but the atmosphere in the unit had changed. It was no longer just a room full of my grandfather's things. It was now colored by the lens of his paranoia. I found myself glancing at the open doorway, half expecting to see a tall, thin man in a watch cap standing at the end of the corridor. The power of his written fear was a potent, infectious thing, and I had to consciously shake it off. It's just a story, I told myself. A sad story. The product of an aging mind in a place that was inherently creepy. This sterile, concrete labyrinth was the perfect breeding ground for paranoia. The echoing footsteps, the identical doors, the profound, humming silence. It was a place designed for unease. It was no wonder my grandfather had populated it with a phantom of his own making. I felt a deep, sorrowful empathy for him. I focused, on the physical task at hand, the simple, repetitive motion of sorting and stacking. It was a grounding activity, a way to chase away the ghosts of my grandfather's prose. I was a different person than he was. I was young, I was rational, I was not lonely. I would not succumb to the same fears that had plagued his final days. I would see this place for what it was, a building, a collection of rooms, nothing more. Still, his description of the man was unnervingly specific. A tall, thin man, a dark watch cap. He never saw his face clearly, just his shape, his presence. It was the kind of detail that felt observed, not invented. But I pushed the thought away. My grandfather had probably seen another tenant, a real person, and his lonely mind had woven this man into a larger, more sinister narrative. That had to be the explanation. As I packed up to leave for the night, I felt a new sense of urgency to finish this task. I wanted to be done with this place, done with the sad legacy of my grandfather's fear. I wanted to empty this unit, to close the door on it for the last time, and to let the memory of the man from 34B fade away with the rest of his forgotten belongings. The unit was not just a storage space. It was a container for his final, unhappy years, and I did not want to spend any more time in it than was necessary. I slid the heavy, corrugated metal door down, the sound of it crashing into place echoing down the silent corridor. I clicked my heavy padlock shut. The unit was secure. My grandfather's ghosts were locked away for the night. As I walked back down the long, empty hallway, I felt a sense of my own strength, my own sanity. I was not. My grandfather, I would not be scared of shadows. The cool night air outside was a welcome relief after the stuffy, stale air of the facility. I got in my car and drove home, the story from the diaries already beginning to feel like a dream. It was a sad, strange, but ultimately fictional account, the product of a mind in decline. I felt a profound sense of pity for the man I had never known, a man who had ended his days so afraid, so alone. Back in my own bright, warm apartment, the storage unit felt a million miles away. Here, there were no long, dark corridors, no humming, silences, no phantom watchers. Here, I was safe. I was in control. The world was a logical, understandable place. The fears of an old man, written in a dusty book, had no power here. They were just stories, and I was not a character in them. I went to sleep that night feeling sad for my grandfather, but secure in my own reality. I had found the answer to the mystery of his final years. It was a sad, simple story of loneliness and paranoia. I had closed the book on it. I was blissfully unaware that by opening his diary, I had not closed his story. I had simply inserted myself into the narrative, taking his place as the main character. And the watcher in the margins was about to turn his attention to me. A few days passed, and the melancholy tale of my grandfather's diary began to fade, softened by the routines of my own, sane life. I convinced myself that my initial unease had simply been an emotional response to his sad story. The storage unit was just a place, the man from 34B just a phantom of an old man's lonely mind. With this renewed sense of logical detachment, I returned to the facility on a Thursday evening, ready to continue my work with a clear head. I unlocked my padlock, rolled up the heavy metal door, and flicked on the single bare bulb. The unit was exactly as I had left it, a landscape of organized chaos. My small, cleared-out work area, a testament to my progress. The air was still and silent. There was no sense of menace, no feeling of being watched. There was only the quiet, dusty reality of the task ahead. I took a deep breath, ready to dive back into the history of my grandfather's life. I had established a system. On my left, I stacked the boxes I intended to keep or sell. On my right, the boxes destined for the dump. The previous visit, I had spent 2 hours sorting through a large, heavy box of old financial records, a tedious but necessary task. I had sealed it back up, clearly marked it toss with a thick black marker, and had placed it firmly on the right side of the unit, on top of 2 other boxes. I remembered it clearly, but it wasn't there. I stood in the entrance of the unit, my eyes scanning the stacks, and I saw it. The box, clearly marked with my own black lettering, was now sitting on the left side of the unit, in the keep pile. It was tucked neatly against the wall, as if it had been there all along. My mind struggled to process the simple, impossible fact of its relocation. It was on the wrong side. My first reaction was not fear, but a wave of self-annoyance. I must have done it myself. I must have been more tired than I thought during my last visit. In my exhaustion, I must have moved the heavy box to the wrong pile and had simply, completely forgotten about it. It was a simple lapse in memory, a sign that I was working too hard, that I was spending too much time in this stuffy, airless place. That had to be the explanation. I shook my head, a small, frustrated laugh escaping my lips. I was becoming as forgetful as my grandfather. I walked over, lifted the heavy box, its weight a familiar, solid thing, and moved it back to the correct pile on the right side of the unit. The world was set right again. A simple mistake, a simple correction. There was nothing to worry about. I refused to let the paranoia of my grandfather's diary infect my own rational mind. I got back to work, determined to ignore the incident. I opened a new box, this one filled with old kitchenware, and began the methodical process of sorting. But my focus was fractured. My eyes kept darting back to the box of financial records, now sitting where it was supposed to be. Had I really moved it? The memory of placing it on the right side was so clear, so certain in my mind. The memory of moving it to the left was a complete and utter blank. The doubt was a small, insistent whisper in the back of my mind. It was the voice of my grandfather's diary. He moves things. I tried to silence it. I was letting the creepy atmosphere of the place get to me, letting his story color my own perceptions. I was tired. I was dealing with the emotional weight of a relative's death. It was only natural that my mind might be a little unreliable at the moment. It was stress, not a spirit. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I started to look at the other boxes, at the stacks of furniture. Had anything else been moved? Was that chair always at that angle? Was that stack of books always in that order? I was beginning to second-guess my own memory, my own actions. The storage unit, which had been a place of quiet, methodical work, was now becoming a place of uncertainty, a room where the physical reality was starting to feel unstable. I finished my work for the night with a new sense of unease. Before I left, I did something I had never done before. I took out my phone and I took a picture of the unit. A clear, wide shot of the stacks of boxes, the placement of the furniture. It was a paranoid, absurd thing to do. But I needed a baseline. I needed a piece of hard, objective data to either confirm or deny what my own faltering memory was telling me. I left the facility that night with a sense of grim purpose. I had a control photo. I had a baseline. My next visit would be a scientific experiment. I would compare the reality of the room to the hard data of my photograph, and I would have my answer. The thought was both terrifying and reassuring. Either the photo would match, proving my memory was failing me, or it would not, proving that my grandfather's fears were terrifyingly real and had now been passed down to me. For 2 days, I stayed away. I let the unit sit, untouched, a sealed chamber for my experiment. I tried not to think about it, but the question of the box was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in my mind. I found myself rereading the paranoid entries in my grandfather's diary, his words no longer sounding like the ramblings of a lonely old man, but like a desperate, clear-eyed warning from the past he had tried to tell me. On Saturday evening, I returned. I stood before the door of Unit 34B, my phone in my hand. The photograph I had taken pulled up on the screen. My heart was pounding. This was the moment of truth. I took a deep breath, unlocked my heavy padlock, and rolled up the metal door with a loud, groaning screech. The same stale, dusty air washed over me. I shone my phone's flashlight inside, my hand trembling. At first glance, everything looked exactly as I had left it. The heavy box of financial records was still on the right side, in the toss pile where I had moved it. The stacks of furniture, the piles of books, it all looked undisturbed. A wave of relief washed over me. I had been wrong. I had been stressed and tired, and I had simply moved the box myself. My grandfather's paranoia was not my own. I was safe. But I had to be sure. I kept the photograph open on my phone and began a meticulous side-by-side comparison. I was no longer just a person clearing out a room. I was a crime scene investigator, searching for a single, out-of-place detail. I compared the stacks of boxes, the angle of the chairs, the placement of every single item. Box A on top of box B. Check. Lamp behind the armchair. Check. Everything was perfect. And then I saw it. It was a small detail, something I would never have noticed without the photograph. A stack of 3 sealed cardboard boxes in the far left corner. In my photograph, the top box was an unmarked plain brown box. But now, as I looked at the stack in front of me, the top box was different. It was a box with the words "kitchen glassware" stenciled on the side. The plain brown box was now the middle box in the stack. I stared at the stack, then back at the photo on my phone. There was no doubt. The boxes had been restacked. Someone had been in this unit. Someone had lifted the heavy top box, switched it with the one below it, and then placed it back down. It was a change so subtle, so pointless, that it could only be one thing: a message. A quiet, terrifying message to let me know that he could get in whenever he wanted. My carefully constructed wall of rationality crumbled to dust. The photograph was my proof. My memory was not faulty. My grandfather was not delusional. It was all real. The man from 34B was real, and he had been in here, in this locked unit, moving my grandfather's things around with a quiet, contemptuous ease. The game he had played with my grandfather was now being played with me. I had inherited my grandfather's stalker. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped me. The storage unit was no longer a sad, dusty place of memory. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. The silence of the facility was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. The long, empty corridors were no longer just hallways. They were his territory. He had a key. He had access. He could come and go as he pleased. and my heavy new padlock was nothing more than a useless piece of metal theater. I backed out of the unit slowly, my eyes still fixed on the restacked boxes. I did not bother to take another photograph. There was no point. I pulled the metal door down, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking too badly to work it properly. As I finally clicked it shut, I was overwhelmed by one single, terrifying thought. If he could get into a locked unit, what else could he do? And what did he want with me? The photograph on my phone was a declaration of war. My denial was a fortress that had been breached, leaving me exposed and terrified in the rubble of my own rationalizations. My grandfather's words, his paranoid scribblings, were no longer the delusions of an old man. They were a field guide to the monster that was now hunting me. I had not just inherited his possessions, I had inherited his nightmare. The man from 34B was real, and I was his new subject of interest. For 2 days I didn't go back. I couldn't. The storage unit, once a place of quiet, melancholy work, was now a place of profound dread. The knowledge that he could get into my locked unit at will had transformed the entire facility into his territory. Every one of the hundreds of identical metal doors was a potential hiding place, every long, silent corridor a potential hunting ground. My key and my padlock were meaningless tokens of a security that did not exist. But the need to continue my work was a practical, nagging reality. My grandfather's affairs needed to be settled, and the monthly rent on the unit was a bill I could not afford to pay indefinitely. And beneath the practical need, there was a darker, more compelling one, a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to see him, to put a face to the ghost that was haunting me. I knew it was a dangerous, foolish impulse, but it was one I could not resist. I decided to go late. Later than I ever had before. I would go after midnight, during the quietest, most deserted hours. My reasoning was a twisted, fear-addled logic. If he was a creature of the shadows, a man who operated in the quiet, then I would have the best chance of seeing him, of catching a glimpse of him during his own active hours. I was willingly walking into the lion's den during feeding time, armed with nothing but a desperate need for answers. I arrived at the facility at 1 a.m. The city was asleep. The large, rolling gate was closed, and I had to punch in my access code to get it to open. It rose with a loud, groaning screech, a sound like a beast opening its iron jaws to swallow me. I drove my car inside the compound and parked near the entrance to my section. The air was cold and still. I was the only person here, or so I hoped. I walked down the long, silent corridor towards my unit, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the profound quiet. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed louder tonight, more menacing. Every shadow seemed deeper. I felt a profound sense of being watched, a feeling so intense it was like a physical touch on the back of my neck. I kept looking over my shoulder, my heart pounding, but the hallway behind me was always empty. I reached my unit, 34B, and for a moment, I just stared at my new, heavy-duty padlock. It was a symbol of my own futility, a brave, useless soldier guarding a gate that the enemy had no need to use. I unlocked it, the click of the mechanism sounding like a gunshot in the silence. I rolled up the metal door, the sound a roaring cacophony that announced my arrival to anyone who might be listening. I stepped inside. I didn't turn on the single bare bulb in the unit. I used my flashlight instead, its beam a nervous, trembling thing that I could control. I stood in the entrance, my back to the open corridor, and I listened. The silence was absolute. There was no scratching, no shuffling, no sound of another person. There was only the low hum of the building's ventilation system and the frantic, wild beating of my own heart. I tried to work. I moved a single box, my movements stiff and self-conscious. I felt like I was on a stage, performing for an unseen audience. I kept my ears strained, listening for any sound from the corridor behind. Me, the simple, mundane task of sorting through my grandfather's things, was now a high-wire act of terror. Every moment stretched into an eternity. I was a mouse, trying to nibble at a piece of cheese while knowing the cat was watching from the shadows. And then, I saw him. It was not a sound. It was a flicker of movement, a shift in the shadows at the far end of the long corridor, reflected in a small, dusty hand mirror that was leaning against a box. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly, silently, turned my head, my eyes peering into the dim, yellow-lit gloom of the hallway. He was there. A tall, thin man, standing perfectly still, watching me. He was just as my grandfather had described him. Tall, unnaturally thin, and wearing a dark woolen watch cap pulled down low on his forehead. His face was a pale, indistinct blur in the eye. Dim light, his features lost in the shadows. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, motionless sentinel at the far end of the corridor, his entire presence focused on me. The watcher in the margins of my grandfather's diary was now watching me. We were locked in a silent, terrifying standoff. I was frozen in the doorway of my unit, my flashlight beam a trembling, useless circle on the concrete floor. He was a statue, of pure menace, his stillness more frightening than any sudden movement could have been. The long, empty corridor stretched between us, a stark, sterile no-man's land. The only sound was the low, buzzing hum of the lights and the frantic, wild pounding of my own heart. He made no move to approach. He made no threatening gesture. He just watched. His observation was a physical force, a pressure that pinned me in place. It was a look of calm, possessive curiosity, the look of a scientist observing a new specimen that has wandered into his terrarium. I was the object of his study, and this entire silent facility was his laboratory. He was not afraid of me. He wanted me to see him. After what felt like an eternity, an entire lifetime compressed into a single terrifying minute, he moved. It was not a sudden movement. He simply took one slow, deliberate step backwards, melting back into the shadows of the intersecting corridor from which he had emerged. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He just retreated, his silent departure as unnerving as his silent appearance had been. And then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, my body trembling, my eyes fixed on the empty corner where he had been. I half expected him to reappear, to rush down the hallway towards me, but there was only silence, a deep, profound, and now utterly terrifying silence. The ghost had shown me its face, or at least its form. It was real, a real man, and he was here, in this building, with me. I abandoned everything. I didn't even bother to close the unit door. I just turned and ran. My footsteps echoed frantically on the concrete, a stark contrast to his own unnerving silence. I ran down the long corridors, my breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Every dark corner, every identical doorway, was a place where he could be, waiting for me. The labyrinth was no longer just disorienting. It was actively hostile. I burst out of the main building and into the cold night air of the empty compound. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped towards the main gate. As I punched in my exit code, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his tall, thin figure emerge from the building, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Only the cold, silent metal city. The drive home was a blur of terror. My mind was replaying the scene over and over. The silent figure, the watch cap, the possessive, unwavering stare. My grandfather's paranoia was not paranoia. It was a testament, a warning. He had tried to tell me, in his own fractured way, about the man who lived in the quiet concrete halls. And I, in my arrogant rationality, had dismissed him. Now, his fear was my own. Back in my apartment, I locked the door, but the flimsy deadbolt brought no comfort. The man in the corridor had a key to my grandfather's life. He had proven he could get into a locked space with ease. The sanctity of my own home now felt like a fragile illusion. If he could get into my storage unit, what was to stop him from getting in here? The fear had followed me home, a passenger. I could not shake. The first act of my inherited nightmare was over. The subtle clues, the moved boxes, the stories from the diary, they had all culminated in this single terrifying visual confirmation. The threat was real. The threat was human. And the threat was now focused on me. I was no longer just the custodian of my grandfather's possessions. I was the new subject of the Watcher from Unit 34B, and I had no idea what he wanted from me. The image of the man in the corridor was a brand on my mind. For 2 days, I avoided the storage facility entirely, the thought of returning to that silent concrete labyrinth filling me with a paralytic dread. He was real, my grandfather's. Ghost had a face, or at least a shape, and it was watching me. The world of rational explanations had been burned to the ground, leaving me alone in a new and terrifying landscape where silent men could walk through locked spaces. But I would not be driven away. A new, harder resolve was forming in the pit of my stomach, a defiant anger that was beginning to push back against the fear. This was my task, my inheritance, my responsibility. I would not let a silent, lurking phantom chase me away from it. I would not let him win. If he was going to play a game of psychological warfare, then I would have to learn how to play back. My first move would be to change the rules of engagement. My previous visits had all been in the evening, in the quiet and the solitude. That was his territory, his hunting ground. I decided I would no longer meet him on his terms. From now on, I would only go to the facility during the busiest hours, on a Saturday afternoon, when the place was filled with the noise and activity of other people. I would surround myself with witnesses, with the comforting chaos of normal life. I would hide in the crowd. My second move was to upgrade my defenses. The simple padlock my grandfather had used, the one I had continued to use, was clearly compromised. He had a key, or he knew how to pick it with ease. It was a useless token. I went to a hardware store and I bought the most formidable padlock I could find, a heavy shrouded block of steel with a complex pick-resistant tumbler system. It was a serious, intimidating piece of hardware. Armed with my new lock and a new strategy, I returned to the storage facility on a bright, noisy Saturday afternoon. The place was almost unrecognizable. The parking lot was filled with cars and moving trucks. The corridors, once silent and empty, now echoed with the sounds of people talking, of boxes being moved, of metal doors scraping open and shut. The air was filled with a sense of purpose and activity. The ghosts were all gone, chased away by the bright, unforgiving light of day. I felt a profound sense of relief. This was just a normal place of business. The terror I had experienced felt like a bad dream, a product of the late-night silence and my own overactive imagination. Surrounded by other people, by the mundane reality of families moving their belongings, my fear seemed almost foolish. The man in the corridor was likely just another tenant, a strange person who kept odd hours. My paranoia had been a symptom of my own solitude. I walked to my unit, my new padlock feeling heavy and powerful in my hand. I felt a surge of confidence. I would change the lock, and the mystery would be solved. My grandfather had likely lost a spare key at some point, and this strange man had found it. It was a simple, logical explanation that I clung to with a desperate hope. I was reasserting my control, one practical step at a time. I opened my old padlock one last time, rolled up the door, and looked inside. Everything was exactly as I had left it in my panicked flight. The boxes were undisturbed. Nothing had been moved. I quickly did what I needed to do, grabbing another box of papers to sort through at home, wanting to minimize my time here. I rolled the door back down, the sound of its descent lost in the general noise of the facility. Then came the satisfying part. I removed the old flimsy padlock. It felt light and useless in my hand. I replaced it with my new one, the heavy block of steel. It clicked shut with a sound that was deep, solid, and wonderfully final. It was a sound of security, of a door being sealed not just against a man, but against my own fear. I felt a sense of profound, triumphant safety. I left the facility that day feeling empowered, my fear replaced by a cool, logical confidence. I had a new lock. I had a new, safer routine. I had taken control of the situation. The man from 34B, whoever he was, would no longer have access to my unit, to my grandfather's things. The game was over because I had changed the locks. I had won. I was safe now. The following Saturday, I returned to the facility with a sense of calm I had not felt in weeks. The bright afternoon sun and the bustling activity of other families provided a comforting blanket of normalcy. I walked down the long corridor to my unit, my footsteps confident. I saw my new lock, that gleaming block of steel, hanging on the latch, untouched and secure. A small, triumphant smile touched my lips. It had worked. I unlocked it, the key turning smoothly in the complex mechanism, and rolled up the door. I had my phone out, the photograph from my last visit ready for comparison. I conducted a meticulous check. Every box, every stack of books, every sheet-draped piece of furniture was in the exact same position I had left it. Nothing had been moved. Not by an inch. The feeling of relief was so profound it was almost dizzying. My new security system was a success. The combination of a new, high-security lock and my refusal to visit during the quiet, isolated hours of the night had apparently solved the problem. The man from 34B, my grandfather's strange ghost, was either a creature of opportunity who was thwarted by a simple lock, or a creature of the night who would not risk being seen in the bright, busy light of day. Either way, he was gone. My work in the unit became peaceful again. I was able to focus on the task at hand, the melancholy but manageable job of sifting through a life. The fear that had once tainted every object was gone. replaced by my original sense of sad curiosity. I was able to see my grandfather's possessions as just that again, things, not as props in a terrifying play being staged by an unseen director. The space was mine again. For 3 consecutive weeks, my new routine held. Every Saturday afternoon, I would arrive, find my lock untouched, and the contents of my unit exactly as I had left them. The memory of the man in the corridor began to feel like a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and the eerie silence of the facility at night. I had been foolish, paranoid. My grandfather's diary had infected my mind, and I had built a monster out of shadows and coincidence. I started to feel a little embarrassed by my own extreme reaction. The heavy-duty lock, the frantic fear. It all seemed like an overreaction now. But I kept the new lock on, and I continued to visit, only during the day. It was a small precaution, a reminder of the fear I had once felt, but the fear itself was gone. I had faced down the strange anomaly, and I had won through simple, practical logic. I was safe. My world returned to its normal, predictable rhythms. The storage unit was once again just a place of work, a temporary, mundane task on my to-do list. The story of the man from 34B became a closed chapter, a strange delusion my grandfather and I had briefly and separately shared. I was ready to finish the job, to empty the unit, and to close this strange chapter of my life for good. But my victory was an illusion. It was a brief, comforting lie I had told myself because the truth was too terrifying to contemplate. I had assumed I was dealing with a common trespasser, a man who could be deterred by a better lock. I had failed to understand the nature of the entity I was dealing with. He was not interested in bypassing my lock. That would be too simple, too crude. He was interested in bypassing my sanity. He had let me have my victory. He had let me build my fortress of steel and daylight. He had given me time to believe I was safe, to let my guard down, to become complacent in my own cleverness. He was patient, and he was waiting for the perfect moment to show me that my new lock, my new schedule, my entire sense of security was a complete and utter joke to him. Because the true horror was not that he could get into my unit. The true horror was that he didn't need a key. He didn't need to break the lock. He had another way in. And his next move would be designed to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that no matter how strong my lock was, the contents of my unit and the contents of my life were always open to him. My new routine was a comforting shield against the memory of the fear. For a month, I visited the storage unit every Saturday afternoon, and every Saturday afternoon, I was met with the same reassuring sight: my heavy steel padlock, untouched and secure. The bustling noise of the facility was a cheerful, mundane soundtrack that drowned out the memory of the late-night silence. The man from 34B was gone. My grandfather's ghost had been exorcised by logic and a better lock. I was making excellent progress. The mountain of boxes was shrinking, my keep and toss piles growing. I was nearing the end of my strange inherited task. I felt a sense of pride in my own resilience. I had been terrified, but I had not abandoned the work. I had faced the strangeness and had imposed my own order upon it. The feeling of control was a welcome, empowering sensation. I was the master of this small metal room once more. On this particular Saturday, I arrived feeling almost completely at ease. The sun was bright, the facility was busy. I greeted the woman at the front desk with a genuine smile. My journey down the long, familiar corridor to Unit 34B was not a walk of dread, but one of simple, purposeful work. I reached my unit, my heavy padlock gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A silent steel guardian that had kept my world safe. I unlocked it, the key turning smoothly, and rolled up the heavy door. The unit looked exactly as I had left it. The stacks of boxes were straight. The furniture was undisturbed. I took out my phone, more out of habit now than any real fear, and compared the sight before me to the photo from my last visit. Everything was in its proper place. I let out a small, satisfied breath and got to work, my guard completely down. My task for the day was to go through the last of the sealed boxes in the back corner. I dragged one of the heavy cardboard boxes into my small, cleared workspace. It was a box I had sealed myself a few weeks prior, labeled MISC Papers. I remembered taping it shut with a sense of finality. One more piece of the past neatly categorized and contained. I took a box cutter and slit the tape, ready to face another pile of my grandfather's dusty history. I lifted the cardboard flaps, and I froze. Sitting directly on top of the packed papers inside the box, a box that I had sealed myself, was a small, perfect, and utterly impossible circle of objects. They were my grandfather's old army medals, the ones I had found weeks ago, at the bottom of his cedar chest. They were arranged with a meticulous geometric precision, their faded ribbons and tarnished metal gleaming in the dim light. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. This was not possible. The box was sealed. I had sealed it myself. The heavy-duty padlock on the unit door had been untouched, locked securely. No one could have gotten into the unit. And even if they had, no one could have gotten into this specific taped-shut box without my knowing. And yet, here they were. His medals, arranged in a perfect mocking circle. The blood drained from my face. My fortress. My new lock. My daylight. Schedule. It was all a joke. A complete and utter sham. He had not been deterred. He had not been thwarted. He had just been waiting. He had let me build my pathetic, flimsy sense of security, only to shatter it with this single, impossible act. He didn't need to pick my lock. He didn't need a key. He had another way in. This was a message of absolute power. It was a demonstration of his complete and total contempt for my defenses. He was showing me that my attempts to control the space were meaningless. He could get into my unit, into my sealed boxes at will. He could move through my world as if the physical barriers of locks and tape and cardboard simply did not exist for him. He was not just a man anymore. He was something else. I stumbled back from the box, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. I looked around the small, cluttered unit, but it was no longer a room full of my grandfather's things. It was a cage, and the bars were not made of metal, but of my own incomprehension. How had he done it? How was this possible? The question was a hammer blow to the foundations of my reality. The man from 34B was not just a stalker. He was an impossibility. I stood there, in the center of the silent unit, for a long time, the open box at my feet. My mind, which always tried to find the logical path, was a complete blank. There was no logical path here. There was no explanation. A man cannot walk through solid steel doors. A man cannot open a sealed box without cutting the tape. What I was seeing was a defiance of the basic laws of physics, an act that belonged in the realm of magic or ghosts. My fear was now laced with a new and terrifying ingredient, a sense of the uncanny. I was not just dealing with a stalker. I was dealing with something that could bypass the fundamental rules of the world. The thought was so overwhelming that I almost laughed. a hysterical, bubbling sound that died in my throat. My grandfather had not been paranoid. He had been a rational man trying to describe an irrational reality. And now it was my reality. My previous fear had been of a man with a key, a simple physical threat. But this was different. This was a threat that had no clear boundaries, no discernible method. How do you defend against an enemy who can move through sealed objects? How do you lock out a ghost? My heavy steel padlock, my symbol of security, was a joke. A child's toy against a force that operated on a different plane of existence entirely. I frantically began to search the unit, my earlier methodical investigation replaced by a panicked, desperate scramble. I ran my hands over the corrugated metal walls, looking for a seam, a panel, a hidden door. I looked up at the thin metal ceiling. I stomped on the concrete floor. There had to be an entry point. There had to be a rational physical explanation. To accept the alternative was to accept that I was completely, utterly, and hopelessly defenseless. But I found nothing. The unit was a perfect, seamless metal box. There were no hidden doors, no loose panels. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. A secure, sealed container. And yet, he had been inside it. The lack of an entry point was more terrifying than finding one would have been. It meant his method of entry was something I could not see, could not comprehend, and could therefore never defend against. I thought of my grandfather's words again. He is touching my things. My grandfather had understood. He had known that the man from 34B was not just a lurker in the hallways. He was a presence that could get inside, that could invade the most secure spaces. My grandfather's fear had not been of a simple man. It had been of this impossible, inexplicable violation. And I had dismissed him as delusional. The guilt was a sharp, bitter taste. This was not just about scaring me anymore. This was a demonstration, a lesson. He was teaching me the true nature of his power. He was showing me that my attempts to control the situation were futile. He was an artist, and his medium was not just my possessions, but the very laws of physics themselves. He was a magician, and I was his sole, terrified audience member, with no idea how the trick was done. I carefully picked up the metals, their familiar weight now feeling alien and contaminated. I placed them back in the cedar chest where they belonged, my hands moving with a strange reverence. They were no longer just my grandfather's metals. They were now a part of this story, a part of his story. They were relics from a war he had fought, and now they were relics from a new war that I was losing. I couldn't stay in the unit any longer. To be surrounded by these objects, each one a potential target for his next impossible rearrangement, was a form of torture. I sealed the box of papers, my movements slow and defeated. I walked out of the unit and locked my heavy, useless padlock. The satisfying click now sounded like a hollow, mocking laugh. I was locking a door that meant nothing. As I walked down the long, silent corridor, every single one of the identical metal doors seemed to hold a new menace. They were not just doors to rooms. They were doorways to other possibilities, to a world where men could walk through walls and rearrange the contents of sealed boxes. My world had come unstitched from reality, and I knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard stone in my gut, that his next move would be even bolder, even more impossible. The weekend was a blur of quiet, escalating panic. The impossible arrangement of the metals had broken something in my mind, The world no longer felt solid. The rules I had taken for granted, that a locked door is a barrier, that a sealed box remains sealed, were apparently optional for the man from 34B. I was living in a world of his making, a world where he was the magician, and I was the horrified captive audience, with no understanding of the trick. I knew I couldn't continue. This alone, the threat had escalated beyond my ability to comprehend, let alone defend against. My own senses were not enough. I needed an authority figure, someone with power in this place, to witness the impossibility with me. I needed the facility manager. I decided I would confront him, not with a complaint about a strange man, but with the clear, undeniable evidence of an impossible breach of security. On Monday, I went to the facility during my lunch break. I didn't go to my unit. I went straight to the small, cluttered front office. The same tired-looking woman was behind the counter, her face a mask of professional indifference. I asked to speak to the manager, and she pointed to a door behind her. I knocked, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm. A man's voice called out, "Come in!" The manager was a large, balding man with a perpetually skeptical expression, as if he'd heard every possible excuse and complaint the world had to offer. I introduced myself as the tenant of 34B, the granddaughter of the previous tenant. I explained that I had a serious security concern. I told him, as calmly as I could, that someone was gaining access to my locked unit without tampering with the padlock. He leaned back in his squeaky office chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Our facility has a state-of-the-art security system. We have cameras on every entrance and exit and coded gate access. The hallways are patrolled. No one is getting into a locked unit without a key." His tone was final, the tone of a man who has already reached his conclusion. "But they are," I insisted, my voice gaining an edge of desperation. "I bought a new, high-security padlock. It has not been tampered with. And yet when I go into my unit, objects have been moved, things I have packed away and sealed, taped boxes have been taken out and rearranged." I was pleading with him, trying to convey the impossibility of it, the sheer wrongness of what was happening. He sighed, a sound of profound, weary boredom. "Ma'am, are you sure you're sealing the boxes correctly? Are you sure you're remembering where you put things? People get tired, they get forgetful. This is a stressful process, cleaning out a relative's belongings. The mind can play tricks." He was giving me the same speech my brother had, the same gentle, condescending dismissal of my own lived experience. He was telling me I was unreliable. "I am not forgetful," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "I have photographic evidence. I have been documenting the state of the unit between my visits." The lie came easily. I had only the one photo, but I needed him to believe I had more, that I was a credible, methodical person. The officer stared at me for a long moment, his skeptical expression unwavering. He did not believe me. "Look," he said finally, leaning forward on his desk. "There is nothing I can do. There is no sign of forced entry on your lock or your door. I cannot launch an investigation based on a tenant's feeling that a box has been moved. As far as I'm concerned, your unit is secure. If you are unhappy with our facility, you are free to terminate your lease at the end of the month." He was washing his hands of me. I stood up, my body trembling with a helpless rage. He was the one person who had the power to do something, to check the security footage, to investigate Unit 34B, to find this man, and he was refusing. He had already decided I was a hysterical, forgetful woman, not worth his time. I had come to him with an impossible story, and he had met it with a wall of complete and total indifference. I was a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. I walked out of his office without another word, my cheeks burning with humiliation. I had been dismissed, invalidated, and treated like a fool. The one person with the authority to investigate, to look at the security tapes, to open the door of 34B, had chosen to believe in my incompetence rather than the evidence of a breach. My fear was now compounded by a profound sense of helplessness. The system was designed to ignore a problem as strange as mine. That night, my frustration outweighed my fear. I needed to talk to someone who would listen, someone who wouldn't just dismiss my story as a symptom of stress. I called my best friend, Rachel. She knew about my grandfather's death, about the tedious task of clearing out his storage unit. I decided to tell her everything, hoping that her friendship would provide a foundation of trust that the uninterested manager lacked. I laid out the entire sordid tale for her on the phone. The diary, the man in the corridor, the restacked boxes, the heavy-duty padlock that had been bypassed, and finally, the impossible appearance of the metals inside a box I had sealed myself. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, a long, quiet pause as she tried to process the cascade of bizarre information I was giving her. "Leah," she said finally, her voice cautious and gentle. "That is a really, really strange story. Are you sure about all this? About the box being sealed?" The question itself was a small betrayal. She was starting from a position of doubt, just like everyone else. She was already looking for the flaw in my narrative, the point where my perception could have failed. "I'm positive, Rachel," I said, my voice tight. I taped it shut myself. There was no way anyone could have gotten into it without cutting the tape. I tried to explain the impossibility of it, the feeling of violation, the certainty I had that my grandfather's paranoia was real and had now been transferred to me. I was begging her to see the pattern, to see the intelligence behind the strange events. "Okay, honey. Okay," she said, her voice shifting into a tone of gentle placation. "I believe that you believe this is happening, but you have to admit, it sounds like something out of a movie. You're dealing with a lot right now. The grief, the stress of this huge task. And that place sounds incredibly creepy. It's the perfect storm for an overactive imagination." She was using the same script as my brother, the same loving, gentle gaslighting. She suggested I take a break from the storage unit. She suggested I see a grief counselor. She suggested that maybe I should hire a professional moving company to just clear the whole thing out, to remove myself from the toxic environment that was clearly affecting my mental state. Every one of her practical, loving suggestions was another confirmation that she did not believe in the reality of the man from 34B. She believed in the reality of my breakdown. I hung up the phone feeling a despair so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. I had now been dismissed by the authorities of the facility and by my own closest friend. There was no one left to turn to. My story was too strange to be shared, my evidence too impossible to be believed. The man from 34B had successfully created a perfect, isolated pocket of reality for just the two of us, a reality that no one else could enter. He was a master of his craft. He knew that the world runs on a set of logical, predictable rules, and by breaking those rules in such a subtle, personal way, he had made himself immune to scrutiny. He had made me the source of the problem. My fear, my story, my perception, I was the one who was out of order, not him. He had successfully weaponized the world's disbelief against me. I was now completely, utterly alone with him. I had no allies. I had no one to confirm my own sanity. It was just me, the ghost of my grandfather, and the silent, patient man in the unit down the hall. and as I sat in my apartment that night, I knew that he had been waiting for this. He had been waiting for my last line of defense, my connection to the outside world, to be severed. And now that it was, he was free to escalate his game. My isolation was a tangible thing now, a silent, invisible wall between myself and the rest of the world. I stopped trying to explain. I stopped trying to find help. To the world, I was a woman succumbing to grief and stress. To myself, I was a woman at war. I decided that if I was going to be trapped in this nightmare, I would at least control the terms of my own suffering. My fear was my own, and I would no longer try to share it. A strange, reckless courage was born from this despair. If my new lock was useless, and if visiting during the busy daylight hours offered no real protection, then what was the point of these precautions? They were a fiction I had created to make myself feel safe. I decided to abandon them. I would return to my original schedule, working late at night. If he was going to haunt me, I would meet the haunting head-on. There was a perverse freedom in having nothing left to lose. So, the following week, I drove to the facility at 10 o'clock at night. The familiar emptiness of the compound did not scare me as it once had. My fear had been replaced by a kind of grim, fatalistic acceptance. This was the reality of my situation. This silent, concrete labyrinth was my battlefield. I punched in, my code, the heavy gate sliding open with a groan, and I drove inside, my heart a cold, steady drum in my chest. I walked down the long, buzzing corridor to my unit, my footsteps the only sound. The air was still and cold. I was not looking for him anymore. I was not listening for him. I was simply there to do a job. I unlocked my heavy, useless padlock and rolled up the door. The contents of the unit were undisturbed, but the sight brought me no relief. I knew that he could move things at will. His restraint was a choice, another move in his silent, patient game. I put on my headphones, turning on a loud, angry playlist, a wall of noise to block out the silence and my own thoughts. I began to work with a frantic, focused energy. I was determined to finish this. I would empty this unit. I would close the account. I would sever this last, tenuous link to my grandfather, and to the man who had inherited his obsession. I would work until I was too exhausted to be afraid. I lost track of time, lost in the mindless physical labor of sorting, packing, and stacking. The loud music in my ears was a shield, creating a small, private bubble of noise in the vast, listening silence of the facility. Box after box, I worked my way deeper into the unit, my body aching, my mind blessedly, mercifully blank. For a few hours, I was just a woman, doing a job. The monster was forgotten. It was close to 1 a.m. when I finally stopped, my body drenched in sweat, my muscles screaming in protest. I had made significant progress. A real, tangible dent in the mountain of my grandfather's possessions. I decided to call it a night. I packed up my things, took off my headphones, and was about to close the unit when I heard the sound. It was not a sound from inside the facility. It was coming from the main entrance. It was a loud, heavy, metallic crash, the unmistakable sound of the main rolling gate, the one at the entrance to the entire compound slamming shut. It was followed by the loud, final thud of a magnetic lock engaging. I froze, my blood running cold. The gate was supposed to be on a sensor, left open for any tenants who were inside the facility. It should not have closed. I ran. I abandoned my things and sprinted down the long, echoing corridor towards the main entrance. As I got closer, I could see that I was right. The massive corrugated steel gate was completely closed, sealing the vehicle entrance. I ran to the small pedestrian door next to it and pushed. It was locked. A heavy industrial magnetic lock held it fast. I was trapped. I was locked inside the entire facility. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I rattled the door, my hands pulling uselessly against the cold, unmoving steel. I looked for an emergency release, a button, a lever, anything. There was nothing. The gate was controlled from the front office, which was now dark and empty. There was no way out until the manager arrived in the morning. I was a prisoner in this concrete maze until sunrise, and I was not alone. I backed away from the locked gate, my mind racing. This was not an accident. This was not a timer malfunction. This was him. He had done this. He had waited for me to come back, to settle into my work, and then he had sealed the exits. He had turned the entire facility into a cage, with both of us inside it. The hunter had finally, officially, trapped the prey. My blood ran cold with the realization. I retreated back into the labyrinth of corridors, my own footsteps echoing a frantic, terrified rhythm. The long hallways, which had been merely eerie before, were now profoundly menacing. Every corner was a potential ambush point. Every one of the hundreds of identical metal doors was a place where he could be hiding, waiting, watching me. I was no longer just in his territory. I was in his trap. As I reached my own corridor, a loud clunk echoed from above, and the overhead fluorescent lights in my section flickered and died, plunging the hallway into a deep, oppressive darkness. The only light was the faint emergency exit sign at the far end of the hall, casting a sickly green glow on the concrete floor. He had cut the power to my section. He was controlling the environment, sculpting the darkness around me. I scrambled, back to my unit, my only source of light, the weak beam from my phone. I half expected him to be standing there, waiting for me. But the unit was empty, just as I had left it. I quickly stepped inside, and with a surge of adrenaline, pulled the heavy metal door down, plunging myself into absolute total blackness. It was a foolish, desperate move. I had just trapped myself in a smaller box within his larger one. I sat on a pile of my grandfather's old blankets, my body trembling in the dark. I was a prisoner, locked in my own storage unit, which was itself locked inside a larger facility. And he was out there, somewhere in the darkened corridors, walking, hunting. My mind was a screaming chaos of what-ifs. What did he want? What was he going to do? Why was he doing this? The silence was a crushing weight. And then I heard a new sound. It was coming from down the hallway. It was a faint, metallic jingle, the sound of a set of keys being held by a steady hand. The sound was slow, deliberate. It was followed by the distinct, sharp scrape of a key being inserted into a lock. My breath caught in my throat. He was opening a unit. He was right outside. I crept to the metal door of my own unit and pressed my ear against the cold, corrugated steel. I could hear the sound more clearly now. The jingle of the keys, the scrape of metal on metal. Then, a soft click, and the groan of another roll-up door being opened. I had to know. I had to see. I slowly, silently, lifted my own door just a few inches from the floor, creating a tiny slit of darkness to peer through. The hallway was bathed in that faint, green, emergency light. And down the hall, about 4 doors down from my own, one of the metal doors was open. I couldn't see him, but I could see the dark, yawning rectangle of the open unit. And as I stared, My eyes adjusting to the gloom, I saw the number painted on the wall next to the open door. It was his number. It was 34B. He was in his own unit. The place my grandfather had feared, the source of it all. He had locked me in, here with him, and then he had simply gone home, to his own small metal room down the hall. He was not hunting me. He was not chasing me. He was just here. He was my neighbor. A neighbor who had the power to lock down the entire building and plunge it into darkness. A neighbor who was now, for the first time, audibly at home. I lowered my door, the silence returning. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of proximity. The monster was not a phantom anymore. He was a man with a key in a room, just a few doors down from my own. I was trapped in this concrete labyrinth for the entire night, with a man who had been haunting me for weeks, a man whose intentions were a complete and terrifying mystery. The game had entered its endgame. The darkness in my unit was absolute, a thick, smothering blanket that erased the world. But it was not the darkness I was afraid of. It was the knowledge of him, just a few doors down, in his own small, dark box. The fear was a living thing, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. I was trapped, a rat in a maze with a very patient, very quiet cat. My options had been reduced to one: survive until morning. For the first hour, I did nothing. I just sat on the floor, my back against a stack of boxes, and I listened. The silence from the corridor was profound. I could hear nothing from his unit, no movement, no sound at all. This was somehow more terrifying than if I could hear him. His silence was a weapon, a tool he used to amplify my own fear, to make my own mind my worst enemy. I was left alone with my own terrifying imagination. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, something inside me began to shift. The paralyzing terror, which had been so all-consuming, began to recede, burned away by a new, colder emotion. It was rage, a pure, primal, and protective rage. He had locked me in here. He had tormented me for weeks. He had desecrated the memory of my grandfather. I would not let him win. I would not let him see me break. I would not be a passive victim, waiting in the dark for him to make his next move. If this was my cage, I would at least be the master of it. I got to my feet, my movements now deliberate and purposeful. The fear was still there, a high-pitched whine in the back of my mind, but my anger was louder. I was no longer a frightened granddaughter sorting through old memories. I was a survivor, and I needed to prepare for the long night ahead. My first task was to build a barricade. My grandfather's old, heavy furniture, which had been a burden to be dealt with, now became a gift. I began to move the pieces, my muscles straining in the darkness. I dragged a heavy, solid oak dresser and wedged it against the thin, corrugated metal of the unit's door. I added a heavy armchair on top of that, and then a stack of the heaviest boxes. The door was now a fortress. Next, I needed a weapon. I fumbled through the box of my grandfather's old woodworking tools, the one I had so carefully packed away. My fingers closed around the handle of a large, heavy claw hammer. The weight of it in my hand was a comfort, a solid, tangible piece of potential violence in a situation that had been so psychological, so ephemeral. It was not much, but it was something. It was a claw of my own. I then created a small defensible nest for myself in the back corner of the unit, behind a large, overturned wardrobe. From here, I had a clear line of sight to the barricaded door, but I was hidden from immediate view. I sat down, the hammer in my lap, my back against the cold metal wall. I was as ready as I could be. I had my fortress, I had my weapon, and I had my resolve. The act of preparation had been a powerful antidote to my fear. It had given me a sense of agency, of control, in a situation where I had been rendered completely powerless. I was no longer just waiting in the dark. I was a guard at my post, a soldier in a trench, waiting for an enemy I could not see, but whose presence I could feel with every fiber of my being. The night was long, but my will was strong. An hour passed, then another. The silence from the corridor remained absolute. He was a master of this game, a master of patience. He knew I was in here. He knew I was afraid. And he was content to just let me sit with my own terror, to let the silence and the darkness do his work for him. He was not a creature of action. He was a creature of atmosphere, but I would not let him win. I focused on my breathing, on the solid weight of the hammer in my lap. I was not my grandfather. I would not succumb to the paranoia, to the fear of the unseen. I would meet his silence with my own. I would meet his patience with my own. This was a battle of wills, waged in the dark, in a locked storage facility on the edge of the city. And I was determined to be the one who was still standing when the sun came up. It was around 3 a.m. when I first heard him leave his unit. The sound was soft, just the gentle groan of his metal door sliding up, and then back down. It was followed by the sound of his footsteps, slow and measured, on the concrete floor of the corridor. He was walking. He was patrolling his territory. My hand tightened on the handle of the hammer, my knuckles white. My entire body was a single coiled spring of tension. He walked the length of the corridor, his footsteps fading as he moved away from my unit. Then, a few minutes later, I heard them returning. He was walking back. He paused directly outside my door. The silence was absolute. I could feel his presence on the other side of the thin metal wall, could imagine him standing there, listening, just as I was. I held my breath. My hammer raised slightly. I was ready. But he did nothing. After a long, agonizing minute of silence, his footsteps simply continued on, moving back towards his own unit. I heard his door groan open, then shut. He was testing me. He was reminding me that he was out there, that he was in control, that he could approach my door whenever he wished. It was a power play, a move in a silent psychological chess match. This pattern repeated twice more throughout the long night. The sound of his door, the slow patrol of his footsteps, the agonizing pause outside my own unit, and then the retreat. He never touched my door. He never made a sound directed at me. But his presence was a constant, terrifying pressure. He was a shark, circling my cage, reminding me that the bars were the only thing keeping me alive. And I knew he had a key. Each time he passed, my resolve hardened. My initial frantic fear was being baked away by the slow, steady heat of my anger, leaving something tougher, more resilient in its place. I was not going to let this man break me. I had survived his strange gifts, his impossible intrusions, and I would survive this long night. I would be here when the sun came up. I would walk out of this facility, and I would end this. As the first, Faint hints of gray light began to filter through the small gaps in the metal door. I felt a wave of triumphant exhaustion. I had done it. I had survived the night. I had been locked in a concrete box with my monster. And I was still here. I had not screamed. I had not panicked. I had sat in the darkness, armed with a hammer, and I had met his silent terror with my own silent defiance. At precisely 7 o'clock, I heard the loud mechanical groan of the main facility gate rolling open. A few minutes later, the fluorescent lights in my corridor flickered back to life, their familiar buzzing hum a sound of salvation. The night was over. The manager had arrived. My imprisonment was at an end. I listened intently, but there was no sound from Unit 34B. The man, my neighbor, had retreated for the day. I slowly, carefully, began to deconstruct my barricade. My body ached with a deep cellular exhaustion, but my mind was sharp, clear. The woman who had been trapped in here last night was not the same woman who was now preparing to leave. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. I had faced the heart of the nightmare, and I was still standing. My mindset had changed forever. I was no longer the victim. I was the survivor. I took the heavy padlock off my door, my hands steady now. I rolled up the metal door and stepped out into the brightly lit corridor. It looked so normal, so mundane, in the light of day. It was hard to believe it had been the scene of such a profound, psychological battle just hours before. I walked down the hall and stood before the closed door of 34B. It was just a door, but I knew what lived behind it, and I knew what I had to do. I would not let this continue. I would not live my life waiting for his next move. I had survived the night, and now I was going on the offensive. I walked out of that facility and straight to my car, my mind already formulating the next phase of my plan. I was going to the police, but this time, I was not going with a strange story. I was going with a demand. I was going to make them open that door. I walked into the police station that morning a different woman. I was not the hesitant, fearful person who had been dismissed before. My exhaustion and my anger had forged a new kind of confidence, a cold, hard certainty. I did not ask to file a report. I walked to the front desk and stated in a clear, unwavering voice that I had been unlawfully held against my will, and that I had proof of a man illegally living inside the secure space storage facility on the industrial road. My new demeanor, my refusal to be treated as a hysterical victim, had an immediate effect. The officer at the desk looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time. He saw not a paranoid woman, but a determined citizen reporting a serious crime. He didn't offer me a pamphlet or a placating smile. He called for a detective. I was finally being taken seriously. My story had not changed, but my delivery of it had. I sat with a detective named Miller, a man with tired eyes but a sharp, focused attention. I laid out the story, but this time, I focused on the provable criminal elements. The fact that the main gate had been locked, trapping me inside. The fact that I had auditory evidence of a person entering and occupying Unit 34B, a unit that was supposed to be vacant. I was not reporting a ghost. I was reporting a trespasser, a man who had created a public safety hazard. Detective Miller listened, taking notes. He was skeptical, I could tell, but he was also professional. An allegation of false imprisonment and illegal habitation was something he had to investigate, no matter how strange the circumstances. He agreed to accompany me back to the facility and have the manager open the unit in question. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The outside world was finally, reluctantly, stepping into my nightmare. We arrived at the facility, 2 police cruisers pulling in behind my small car. The sight of the official vehicles in the familiar, dreary parking lot was surreal. The facility manager came out of his office, his expression a mixture of annoyance and alarm. When Detective Miller explained the situation, the manager's protests about my overactive imagination died in his throat. He had no choice but to comply. He was now dealing with the law, not just me. The 5 of us, myself, the manager, Detective Miller, and another officer, walked down the long, silent corridor. It was the same walk I had taken 100 times, but this time I was not alone. I was flanked by armed police officers. We stopped before the closed, silent door of Unit 34B. It looked just like any other door, innocuous and unassuming, but I knew what secrets it held. I knew whose world was just on the other side of that thin metal wall. The manager fumbled with his master key, his hand shaking slightly under the stern gaze of the detective. He inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud, definitive click. The moment of truth was here. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. What would we find? Would he be in there? Would the room be empty, making me look like a fool once more? The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air of the silent corridor. The manager and one of the officers rolled up the heavy metal door. It rose with a familiar groaning screech, revealing the dark interior of the unit. The space was almost completely empty. There was no mountain of boxes, no furniture shrouded in sheets. There was only a single, overturned plastic bucket in the center of the room, a filthy sleeping bag piled in a corner, and a small, pathetic collection of empty food cans and water bottles. At first glance, it looked like the simple, sad den of a homeless person. I felt a momentary pang of disappointment. This was it? This was the source of all my terror? A simple squatter? The police officers moved into the unit, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. It seemed my great, terrifying mystery was about to have a very mundane, very pathetic solution. But then Detective Miller called out from the back of the unit. "Well," he said, his voice a low, strange mixture of disbelief and awe, "it seems your grandfather wasn't the only one keeping a diary." He shone his flashlight on the back wall of the unit, and I saw it. Piled neatly against the wall were dozens of cheap, spiral-bound notebooks, and on the floor next to them, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My grandfather's woodworking tools, and a small pile of freshly carved wooden dolls, each one identical to my own. I walked into the unit, my legs feeling unsteady. The police officer handed me one of the notebooks. The cover was blank, but when I opened it, I saw my grandfather's name at the top of the page, written in a tight, precise script. The page was filled with dates, times, and observations. Arrived 7:15 p.m. Worked on box of books. Seemed tired. Left at 10:02 p.m. Dropped a screwdriver. It was a meticulous, obsessive surveillance log of my grandfather's final years. Detective Miller picked up another notebook, one from the top of the pile. He opened it and read a line aloud. Leah arrived at 7:03 p.m. wearing a blue coat. Seems more determined today. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a new, horrified understanding. "This one is about you," he said, his voice a low whisper. "He's been watching you since the day you first came here." The man from 34B hadn't just been a phantom. He had been a historian, and we were his subjects. The notebooks documented everything. The things I sorted, the clothes I wore, the times I arrived and left. There were even crude, hand-drawn maps of my unit, showing how I had rearranged the boxes after each visit. His knowledge of my actions was total. He had been watching, not just from the corridor, but somehow from a much closer vantage point. He had seen everything, every move, every decision. While Miller looked through the notebooks, the other officer was examining the back wall of the unit. "Hey, detective," he called out, his voice muffled. "You're gonna want to see this." He was knocking on the corrugated metal panel at the very back of the unit. It rang hollow, a stark contrast to the solid sound of the side walls. He pushed against it, and a large section of the metal sheeting swung inwards with a low groan, revealing a dark, gaping hole. Behind the panel was not a concrete wall. It was the interstitial space of the building, the dark, dusty void between the rows of units. It was a hidden corridor, a secret pathway that ran the length of the building, connecting everything. It was filled with pipes, wiring, and the thick, suffocating darkness of a place that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. This was how he had moved. This was how he had gotten into my unit. The mystery of his impossible access was solved. He hadn't bypassed my lock. He had simply gone around it. He had come into my unit from behind, through the thin metal wall that I had assumed was a solid barrier. He could likely access any unit in this entire section of the facility. He was not a tenant of a single unit. He was a resident of the entire building, and the empty spaces were his hallways. The discovery was a profound architectural horror. The building itself was compromised, its very structure a labyrinth for him to navigate at will. The police officers stood at the edge of the opening, their flashlights cutting uselessly into the profound darkness of the crawl space. He could be anywhere. He could be in the walls of the very corridor we were standing in right now, listening to us, watching us. My grandfather's paranoia now seemed like a completely rational response to his situation. He had known on some instinctual level that the man from 34B was not just a neighbor. He was a presence that could not be kept out, a man who could see him even when he was locked safely inside his own unit. He had been trying to describe a man who could walk through walls, and no one had believed him. Now I did. The revelation was partial, but it was devastating. We knew how he moved. We knew the depth of his obsession. We had his handwriting, his strange carvings. But we still didn't know who he was, or why he was doing this. The notebooks contained no name, no personal details, only his cold, precise observations of us. He was a ghost who had mastered the building's secret geography. As the officers prepared to enter the crawl space, to begin their hunt for the man in the wall, I felt a new wave of terror. The confrontation I had so desperately craved was about to happen. But the man they were hunting was not just a simple trespasser. He was the king of this dark, hidden kingdom, and we had just kicked down the door to his throne room. And I had a terrible feeling that he would not be captured easily. Detective Miller ordered me to wait in the main corridor while he and the other officer prepared to enter the crawl space. The manager, looking pale and sick, was instructed to wait by the main entrance. The hunt was about to begin. I stood by the open door of my own unit, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange, vindicating sense of triumph. I was no longer the sole witness. The real world, in the form of 2 armed police officers, was finally entering the nightmare with me. The 2 officers, flashlights in hand and weapons drawn, disappeared into the dark, narrow opening in the back of Unit 34B. Their flashlight beams were swallowed by the profound, oppressive darkness of the space between the walls. I was left alone in the silent, brightly lit corridor, listening. Every sound from within the walls was now magnified, freighted with a terrible significance. The hunt for the man who had haunted my life had begun, and I was a helpless bystander. For several minutes, there was only silence. A deep, tense, and expectant silence. I imagined the officers moving slowly through the cramped, dusty crawl space, their senses on high alert. And I imagined him, the quiet man, flattened against a wall in the darkness, watching their lights approach, as silent and as still as a spider in its web. He was in his own territory now. He had the advantage. He knew the secret geography of this place. Then, the silence was shattered. I heard a muffled shout from deep within the walls, followed by the sound of a scuffle, a frantic, desperate scrambling. It was a sound of pure chaos, of a sudden, violent confrontation happening in the dark, unseen spaces of the building. My heart leaped into my throat. They had found him. The ghost was real, and they had cornered him in his den. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to decipher the sounds of the struggle. The sounds were chaotic and confusing. I heard a loud clang, as if something metal had been thrown, followed by another shouted command from one of the officers. The sounds were moving, retreating deeper into the facility, away from Unit 34B. He was running. He was fleeing through the hidden hallways that he had controlled for so long, and they were chasing him. The labyrinth was now a battlefield, and the battle was happening all around me. I stood in the corridor, a helpless, terrified listener. The sounds of the chase would fade, and then grow louder again as they moved through the network of crawl spaces. It was a horrifying, disembodied conflict. I could hear the echoes of their pursuit, the muffled shouts, the desperate scramble. But I could see nothing. The quiet, sterile storage facility had become a place of frantic, invisible violence. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the far end of the facility, near the main loading docks. It was the sound of a metal panel being kicked out from the inside. A moment later, I heard Detective Miller's voice, bellowing in frustration. I didn't need to see what had happened. I knew. He was gone. He had an escape route, a bolt hole, a secret door that led back out into the real world. He had vanished. The officers emerged from Unit 34B a few minutes later, their faces grim, their uniforms covered in dust and cobwebs. "He's gone," Detective Miller said, his voice tight with frustration. "He had a whole network back there. It connects to the main ventilation shafts. He could have come out anywhere. By the time we figured out the layout, he had completely disappeared. The man in the wall had simply melted back into the world. They had his home, his nests, his strange, obsessive logs. But the man himself was a ghost again. They had enough evidence to issue a warrant for a man they couldn't name, for a face they didn't have a clear photo of. He was a phantom, a John Doe who had been living in the walls of a storage facility for what they now estimated to be several years, long before I had ever inherited the key to my grandfather's unit. I was simultaneously relieved and terrified, relieved that he was gone from the immediate vicinity, that the physical threat had been chased away. But I was terrified by the knowledge that he was still out there. A man with his obsessive nature, with his patient, methodical cruelty, was not a man who would simply give up his project. He had been driven from his home, from his nest, and I was the one who had done it. The police investigation went nowhere. Without a clear image, a name, or a fingerprint. The man in the wall remained a phantom. He was a ghost in the system, a John Doe who had successfully lived outside of society, within its very walls, and had vanished back into it without a trace. The case grew cold. Another bizarre, unsolved file in a dusty records room. The story of the man from 34B ended with a question mark. I finished clearing out my grandfather's unit, but the work was no longer a sad, quiet task of remembrance. It was a grim, joyless chore. I hired movers to take the last of the furniture away. I threw away his books, his records, his tools. I couldn't bear to keep them. They were contaminated by the memory of the man who had watched over them, who had used them in his strange, secret world. I just wanted it all to be gone. When the unit was finally completely empty, a hollow, echoing metal box, I felt no sense of relief. I handed the key back to the facility manager, who couldn't quite meet my eye. I closed my account, severing my last tie to the place. But as I walked away from the secure space storage facility for the last time, I knew that it was not over. I had inherited my grandfather's possessions, and I had inherited his ghost, and a ghost like that does not let go easily. I moved to a new apartment, a modern, characterless building in a new part of the city. It was a place with no history, no attic, no basement, no charming nooks or crannies. It was a simple, sterile box with solid walls and new, secure locks. I tried to build a new life for myself, one that was free from the echoes of the past, free from the fear of hidden, empty spaces. I tried to forget, but the paranoia is a part of me now. It is my true inheritance. I check my locks 3 times before I go to bed. I am a light sleeper. My ears always attuned to the sounds of the building, listening for a footstep, a scratch, a jingle. I cannot be in a quiet room without feeling a sense of profound, expectant dread. The silence is no longer a comfort. It is a canvas onto which my fear paints its worst masterpieces. I often think about him, the quiet man. I wonder where he is. I wonder if he has found a new home, a new set of empty spaces to colonize. Or is he still out there, a ghost in the city, watching, waiting? I wonder if his obsession was with the unit, with my grandfather, or if, in the end, it had transferred to me. Was I just the unfortunate custodian of his haunting, or had I become the new subject of his terrible silent study? I tell myself that I am safe. He has no way of knowing where I live now. I have no connection to my old life, to the storage unit. I am anonymous again, just another face in the crowd. He was a man tied to a place, to a history. That place is no longer a part of my life. Therefore, he should no longer be a part of my life. I repeat this to myself every day, a mantra against the creeping, quiet fear. But the fear is a patient thing. It lingers. It waits. It finds the smallest cracks in your resolve and seeps in. Sometimes, late at night, I will hear a floorboard creak in the apartment above me, and my heart will seize. I will lie in bed, my body rigid, and I will listen, just as I did in the cabin, just as I did in the storage unit. The fear is a lesson that you never forget. Last night, I was woken from a shallow, troubled sleep. It was after midnight. The apartment was silent. The building was asleep. But there was a sound coming from the hallway, from just outside my own front door. It was a faint, metallic sound. A soft, almost imperceptible jingle. The sound of a set of keys, being held by a very quiet, very patient hand. It was followed by the soft, sharp scrape of a single key, being slid gently into the lock of my apartment door. I lie here now, in the darkness of my new safe home, and I am listening. I am listening to him try the keys, one by one. The man from 34B, my grandfather's. Ghost, my quiet, patient, and relentless inheritance. He has found me, and he is coming home.